The words sliced through the air like razor blades, sharp and deliberate. I heard them clearly even though they thought I couldn't. You seriously think anyone cares what the librarian thinks? She's just the book lady. Mr. Kale's voice carried that familiar sneer, the one he used when he wanted people to know he was superior. Behind him, Miss Fletcher laughed, a high-pitched sound that echoed down the hallway. They stood near the main office, not even trying to hide their contempt. I kept walking, my arms full of student files I'd been asked to retrieve from storage. My face stayed calm, neutral. I stayed still, silent, but something deep within me broke and rebuilt at once. This wasn't just another insult to brush off. This wasn't harmless workplace banter. This was calculated cruelty from people who thought they held all the power. What they didn't know was that those files in my arms contained information they'd never wanted anyone to see. Numbers that didn't add up. Records that had been altered. Evidence of favoritism so blatant it made my stomach turn. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was invisible. They were about to learn how wrong they were. My name is Ray Orrin, and I've been the head librarian at Pinewood High School for 11 years. Most people barely notice me. I was background noise, the quiet woman at the circulation desk, who helped students find research materials and kept the library organized. I liked it that way, honestly. Being invisible meant people forgot I was there. They talked freely around me. They left documents on tables. They had conversations they assumed no one important would overhear. For 10 years, that invisibility had been peaceful. Then Mr. Kale arrived as the new assistant principal, and Miss Fletcher became the head of student discipline. Everything changed. At first, it was subtle. Comments about the library being outdated. Suggestions that students didn't need physical books anymore. Budget discussions where library funding was always the first thing they wanted to cut. Then it became personal. They mocked students who came to the library regularly. They called kids who preferred reading over sports antisocial and problematic. They made jokes about me being stuck in the past, clinging to irrelevance. But they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated what a librarian actually does. We don't just shelve books. We organize information. We catalog data. We notice patterns. And I had been noticing patterns for months. The first Rayall crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in October. I was reshelving returned books when I found a disciplinary report that had been left on a study table. It detailed a suspension for a student named Trevor Kincaid. I knew Trevor. Quiet kid. Excellent grades, never caused problems. The report claimed he'd been caught cheating on a history exam. Something felt wrong. Trevor wasn't a cheater. I'd helped him with research projects for 3 years. He was meticulous, almost obsessive about citing sources correctly. Cheating didn't fit his character. I shouldn't have looked deeper. The report wasn't my business, but curiosity got the better of me. So I checked the library's computer logs. Trevor had been in the library during the time the report claimed he was cheating in Mr. Kale's office, serving a different detention. The timeline was impossible. Trevor couldn't have been in 2 places at once. I made a copy of both the disciplinary report and the library logs. I filed them carefully in a folder I labeled discrepancies and locked it in my desk drawer. That folder would grow much thicker in the coming months. November brought budget season, and with it, the announcement I'd been dreading. Mr. Kale called an all-staff assembly during lunch period. He stood at the podium in the auditorium, his smile wide and practiced. "We're implementing strategic reorganization to modernize Pinewood High," he announced, his voice booming through the microphone. "We'll be reallocating resources from outdated programs to technology initiatives that actually benefit students." My throat tightened. I knew what was coming. The library will have its budget reduced by 70%. We'll be converting half the space into a computer lab and study hub. The words hit like physical blows. 70%. Half the space. He might as well have announced they were shutting it down completely. Miss Fletcher sat in the front row, nodding along enthusiastically. A few teachers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. No one challenged him. I sat in the back, my hands gripping the armrest so tightly my knuckles turned white. Humiliation burned through me, hot and sharp. This wasn't just about the library. This was about erasing me, making me irrelevant, pushing me out. But as I sat there listening to him talk about modernization and efficiency, I made a decision. I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the truth. I didn't storm out of the assembly. I didn't confront Mr. Kale or demand answers. That wasn't how this would work. Instead, I went back to the library and opened my computer. I started with the school's budget reports, which were technically public record. Any staff member could access them through the district portal. The numbers didn't match up. According to the official budget, the library was costing the school far more than it actually was. Expenses were inflated. Supply costs were doubled. Even my salary was listed incorrectly, showing I was paid $15,000 more than I actually made. Someone had been manipulating the budget to make the library look like a money drain. I downloaded every budget report from the past 3 years. I created spreadsheets comparing the reported expenses with actual receipts and purchase orders I'd kept in my own meticulous files. The evidence was damning, but I needed more than financial discrepancies. I needed to understand why. So I started watching more carefully. I listened to conversations. I paid attention to who met with whom. I tracked which students were suddenly getting suspended and which ones seemed immune to consequences. The pattern became clear quickly. Students with wealthy parents got second chances. Students without connections got expelled for minor infractions. And Mr. Kale was at the center of all of it. December brought the winter formal, and with it, my first major breakthrough. The student council had reserved the library's community room for decoration preparation. I stayed late to help them access supplies. That's when I overheard the conversation. Mr. Kale and Ms. Fletcher were in the administrative office next door. The walls were thin. Their voices carried clearly through the shared ventilation system. The Patterson family came through with another donation, Mr. Kale said. $20,000 this time. Their son's grades are safely secured for the semester. Ms. Fletcher laughed. What about the Garcia situation? The mother keeps calling about the suspension. Let her call. She can't prove anything. We'll just say her daughter was disrespectful. It's her word against ours. My hands froze on the supply closet key. They were taking bribes. They were selling grades and protection to wealthy families while punishing students who couldn't pay. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The audio quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to understand what they were saying. They talked for 20 minutes, discussing 3 other families, specific dollar amounts, and which teachers were asking too many questions about grade changes. When they finally left, I sat in the dark library, listening to the recording 3 times to make sure I'd heard correctly. I had. This was bigger than budget manipulation. This was corruption that affected every student in the school. Over winter break, I organized everything I'd collected. The budget discrepancies, Trevor's impossible suspension, the recording of Mr. Kale and Ms. Fletcher discussing bribes, copies of grade changes that had been made without teacher approval. I created a timeline cross-referencing every piece of evidence with dates and documents. I made backup copies of everything and stored them in 3 different locations: my home, a safety deposit box, and a secure cloud account. But I didn't go to anyone yet. Not the principal, not the school board, not the district office. I knew that if I moved too soon, they'd find a way to discredit me. They'd call me bitter, vengeful, a disgruntled employee upset about budget cuts. I needed more. I needed evidence so overwhelming that no one could dismiss it. When school resumed in January, I implemented my strategy. I started asking students questions. Casual, friendly inquiries about how classes were going, whether grades seemed fair, if they'd noticed anything unusual about disciplinary decisions. I never pushed. I never led them toward specific answers. But I listened carefully and I took notes. Students started trusting me. They confided things they couldn't tell teachers or parents. Stories of unfair treatment, favoritism, and punishment that seemed random and excessive. Every story became another piece of my growing file. By February, my documentation had expanded to fill 3 large binders. But I was still missing one crucial element: proof of where the bribe money was going. The answer came from an unlikely source. Mrs. Winters, the school secretary, had always been kind to me. She brought me coffee sometimes and chatted during slow periods. One afternoon, she seemed troubled. I asked if she was okay. I probably shouldn't say anything, she said quietly, glancing toward the administrative wing. But Mr. Kale's been asking me to process expense reports that don't make sense. Conference registrations for events that don't exist. Supply purchases from companies I can't find online. She pulled out her phone and showed me photos she'd secretly taken of several reports. The amounts were significant. Thousands of dollars paid to shell companies, conferences that had no online presence, training sessions that never appeared on any calendar. I think he's stealing from the school, she whispered. But I don't know what to do. He'll just say I made mistakes if I report it. I made copies of her photos. I promised her I'd handle it carefully, that her name wouldn't come up unless absolutely necessary. With her evidence added to mine, I finally had what I needed: financial fraud, bribery, grade manipulation, and discriminatory discipline practices. The case was complete. Now I just needed the right moment to expose it all. That moment came in March. The school board announced a special meeting to review Pinewood High's academic performance and budget efficiency. Mr. Kale was scheduled to present his success metrics and request additional administrative funding. I submitted a request to add a library report to the agenda. The board approved it, probably assuming I'd beg for restored funding or make some emotional plea about the importance of books. They had no idea what was coming. I spent 2 weeks preparing my presentation. Every fact was verified 3 times. Every document was organized chronologically. I practiced my delivery until I could present the entire case calmly and professionally, without emotion clouding the facts. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. Part of me was terrified. What if they didn't believe me? What if Mr. Kale had already influenced the board members? What if I was risking everything for nothing? But a bigger part of me knew this was right. Students were being hurt. Money was being stolen. The school's integrity had been compromised. Someone had to speak up. And since no one else would, it had to be me. The next evening, I arrived at the district office 30 minutes early. I carried a locked briefcase containing 3 copies of my complete evidence file, each over 200 pages. Mr. Kale was already there, looking confident and relaxed. He didn't even glance in my direction. That would change soon enough. The meeting started with routine business: budget approvals, calendar updates, minor policy adjustments. Mr. Kale presented his report about improved test scores and efficient resource allocation. The board members nodded along, looking impressed. Then it was my turn. Good evening. I'm Rewrote, head librarian at Pinewood High. I'm here to present evidence of significant administrative misconduct affecting the school's integrity and student welfare. The room went silent. Mr. Kale's head snapped up. Ms. Fletcher, sitting in the audience, leaned forward. I opened my briefcase and distributed the evidence packets. You'll find documentation of financial fraud, bribery, discriminatory discipline practices, and grade manipulation. Everything is sourced, dated, and verified. For the next 40 minutes, I walked them through everything. I played the recording of Mr. Kale and Ms. Fletcher discussing bribes. I showed the budget manipulations. I presented Trevor's case and 12 others like it. I explained the shell companies and fake conferences. Mr. Kale tried to interrupt 3 times. Each time, the board chair told him to wait until I finished. When I reached the final page, I looked directly at Mr. Kale. His face had gone from red to pale. His confident smirk had disappeared completely. These actions have damaged student trust, misused taxpayer money, and violated district policy. I'm formally requesting a full investigation. The board chair cleared his throat. Mr. Kale, do you have a response? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time since I'd known him, he had no clever words, no smooth explanation. The truth had finally caught up to him. The meeting adjourned with the board chair announcing an immediate investigation. Mr. Kale and Ms. Fletcher were placed on administrative leave, pending the inquiry's outcome. As people filed out of the room, several board members approached me. They thanked me for my courage. They assured me the investigation would be thorough. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt exhausted. Exposing the truth was necessary, but it didn't erase the damage that had been done. Mr. Kale brushed past me on his way out. He leaned close and whispered, "You'll regret this. You have no idea what you've started." His threat didn't scare me. People who've already lost their power always resort to intimidation. It's all they have left. The next morning, news of the investigation spread through the school. Students whispered in hallways. Teachers gathered in small groups. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. I kept quiet. I went about my regular duties, shelving books, helping with research projects, maintaining the library's normal routine. But behind the scenes, the investigation was moving quickly. District auditors descended on the school. They interviewed students, teachers, and staff. They reviewed every document I'd provided and requested additional records. Within 2 weeks, they'd confirmed everything. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Mr. Kale and Ms. Fletcher were fired. Criminal charges were filed for embezzlement and fraud. And just like that, their reign of corruption ended. The aftermath wasn't simple or clean. Some teachers had known about the corruption and stayed silent. They faced their own consequences, ranging from reprimands to transfers. Several wealthy families whose children had benefited from the bribery scheme faced investigations. 2 were ordered to repay money, and their children's grades were reviewed and corrected. Students who'd been unfairly suspended or expelled had their records cleared. Trevor Kincaid's false cheating accusation was removed from his transcript. He came to the library to thank me personally. "I thought no one believed me," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I thought I'd have that on my record forever." I assured him that truth always matters, even when it takes time to surface. But not everyone was grateful. Some parents were angry that the situation had been exposed. They complained that the investigation was disruptive. They said I should have handled it quietly, internally. They wanted the corruption to continue as long as their children benefited. Their complaints didn't bother me. I hadn't done this for gratitude or approval. I'd done it because it was right. The library's budget was restored. The conversion plans were canceled. The school board even approved additional funding for new books and technology. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was knowing that students would be treated fairly again. By April, a new assistant principal had been hired. Mrs. Chun was everything Mr. Kale hadn't been. Transparent, fair, and genuinely interested in student welfare. She visited the library her first week. "I've heard a lot about you," she said with a warm smile. "Thank you for what you did." It took tremendous courage. I appreciated her words, but I was ready to return to normalcy. The attention made me uncomfortable. I preferred being invisible again, just the librarian doing her job. But invisibility wasn't possible anymore. Students sought me out for advice. Teachers confided in me. I'd become someone people trusted, someone they turned to when they needed help. It was strange being visible, but it was also meaningful. One afternoon, a group of students approached me with a proposal. They wanted to create a student advocacy committee, a group that would ensure student voices were heard in school decisions. "We want to make sure what happened before can never happen again," their leader said. "Will you be our faculty advisor?" I agreed, not because I wanted more responsibility, but because they deserved support. They were learning the same lesson I had, that silence enables wrongdoing and speaking up creates change. The committee flourished. They met weekly, discussing everything from dress code policies to class scheduling. They learned to research, present evidence, and advocate effectively. Watching them, I realized this was my real legacy. Not exposing corruption, but empowering students to recognize and confront injustice themselves. Summer arrived, bringing the end of another school year. As I prepared the library for the break, I reflected on everything that had happened. I thought about Mr. Kale and Ms. Fletcher. They pled guilty to reduced charges and received probation and restitution orders. No jail time, but their careers in education were finished. Part of me wished they'd faced harsher consequences, but another part recognized that being stripped of their power and reputation was its own form of justice. Mrs. Winters, the secretary who'd provided crucial evidence, had been promoted to administrative assistant under Mrs. Chun. She stopped by the library on the last day of school. "I never thanked you properly," she said. "You protected my name during the investigation, just like you promised. I might have lost my job if you hadn't." I told her she'd been brave to come forward, that her evidence had been essential. We talked for a while about new beginnings and second chances, about how institutions could heal when people chose integrity over convenience. As she left, I realized that this whole experience had taught me something fundamental about power. Real power isn't about authority or control. It's about using whatever resources you have to protect truth and defend people who can't defend themselves. For 11 years, I thought being a librarian meant staying neutral, remaining uninvolved. Now I understood that organizing information was inherently political. Deciding what to document, what to preserve, what to bring to light, those were choices that shaped reality. The next school year began with renewed energy. The Student Advocacy Committee had grown to 25 members. The library buzzed with activity as students worked on research projects, club meetings, and study groups. Mrs. Chen implemented new policies requiring transparency in disciplinary decisions and grade changes. Every action had to be documented and justified. Multiple administrators had to approve significant penalties. The system wasn't perfect, but it was infinitely better than what had existed under Mr. Kale. I continued my regular duties, but with a new awareness. I noticed patterns more quickly. I questioned inconsistencies immediately rather than letting them accumulate. One day in October, I observed something concerning. A new teacher, Mr. Graves, seemed to be favoring certain students while being unnecessarily harsh with others. The pattern was subtle, but present. I didn't want to believe we were returning to old problems, but I couldn't ignore what I saw. So I documented it carefully, just as I'd done before. I collected examples. I tracked patterns. I spoke quietly with affected students. After 2 weeks, I had enough information to approach Mrs. Chen privately. I showed her my documentation and explained my concerns. She listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and thanked me for bringing it to her attention. She investigated immediately. Turns out Mr. Graves wasn't corrupt, just inexperienced. He genuinely hadn't realized his behavior was creating problems. Mrs. Chen provided training and mentorship. The situation improved quickly. This was how the system should work. Problems identified early, addressed transparently, resolved fairly. By winter break, Pinewood High felt like a completely different school. Teachers seemed more relaxed. Students were more engaged. The atmosphere had shifted from fearful and cynical to hopeful and collaborative. The school board recognized the transformation. They asked me to present at a district-wide conference about creating accountability systems in schools. I initially declined. Public speaking wasn't my strength, and I didn't want attention. But Mrs. Chen convinced me. Other schools need to hear this. Not just about exposing corruption, but about building cultures where corruption can't take root. She was right. So I agreed. The presentation went better than expected. Librarians, teachers, and administrators from across the district attended. I talked about documentation systems, pattern recognition, and creating channels for reporting concerns safely. But I also emphasized something else, the importance of people who notice. Schools need people who pay attention, who question inconsistencies, who care enough to act when something's wrong. Several attendees approached me afterward. They shared their own stories of witnessing misconduct and feeling powerless to address it. I listened to each one. I offered advice where I could. But mostly, I just validated their concerns and encouraged them to trust their instincts. One librarian from another school hugged me. You made me realize I'm not just organizing books. I'm protecting information. That matters. Yes, I told her. It absolutely matters. Spring brought the trial for Mr. Kale's criminal charges. I was called to testify. Walking into that courtroom felt surreal. Mr. Kale sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller somehow, diminished. I testified for 2 hours, walking through the evidence I'd collected, explaining my documentation process, answering questions from both prosecutors and defense attorneys. Mr. Kale's lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive, someone with a grudge who'd manufactured evidence. But the documentation spoke for itself. Every piece was verified by multiple sources. The timeline was airtight. When I finished testifying, I felt drained but satisfied. I told the truth clearly and completely. That was all I could do. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty on all charges. Mr. Kale's sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month. I didn't attend. That chapter was closed for me. But I heard later that several students did attend. They wanted him to see them, to know they were watching, to understand that his actions had real consequences for real people. Trevor Kincaid was among them. He'd graduated early with honors and received a full scholarship to a prestigious university. His future, which Mr. Kale had tried to damage with false accusations, was bright and uncompromised. That felt like justice to me. Not just punishment for wrongdoing, but restoration for victims. Not just ending corruption, but creating space for students to thrive. As another school year ended, I found myself thinking about legacy. Not my own, necessarily, but the collective legacy of everyone who'd worked to rebuild Pinewood High's integrity. Mrs. Winters continued excelling in her new role. She developed new administrative systems that made budget tracking transparent and accessible to all staff. Mrs. Chun had been named Principal of the Year by the State Education Association. She deserved it. Under her leadership, test scores had improved, discipline referrals had decreased, and student satisfaction surveys showed remarkable increases in trust and engagement. The Student Advocacy Committee had successfully proposed 3 new policies, including a peer mediation program and a student voice requirement in curriculum planning. These weren't flashy changes. They wouldn't make headlines, but they represented something profound. A school where people at every level felt responsible for maintaining ethical standards. On the last day of school, the committee presented me with a plaque. It read, "To Ray Oren, who taught us that quiet courage changes everything." I hung it in the library, not prominently, but where I could see it from my desk. A reminder that speaking up matters, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. That summer, I took a real vacation for the first time in years. I needed distance and perspective. When I returned in August, ready for a new school year, I felt genuinely excited about the future. Year 3, after the investigation, brought new challenges. Budget cuts at the district level threatened programs across all schools. The library wasn't specifically targeted this time, but all departments faced reductions. I approached this situation differently than I'd handled Mr. Kale's corruption. Instead of collecting evidence alone, I organized. I brought together librarians from all district schools. We compiled data showing the library's impact on student achievement, graduation rates, and college readiness. We presented our findings to the school board collectively. 20 librarians speaking with one voice, supported by solid research and measurable outcomes. The board restored most of our funding. They recognized that we weren't asking for special treatment, just fair consideration based on evidence. This experience taught me another valuable lesson. Individual courage matters, but collective action creates systemic change. The district librarians continued meeting quarterly. We shared resources, discussed challenges, and supported each other. We'd formed a network that made all of us stronger. Students noticed the difference. The library remained a hub of activity, a place where they felt supported and valued. Trevor Kincaid, now in his 3rd year of college, came back to visit during winter break. He brought a friend who was considering education as a career path. "I wanted him to meet you," Trevor said. "You showed me what educators should be. Someone who actually fights for students." His words meant more to me than any formal recognition ever could. By the 4th year, Pinewood High had become a model for other schools. We hosted visitors from across the state who wanted to learn about our transformation. I participated in these visits, not as the hero of some dramatic story, but as one voice among many explaining how systems could be built to prevent corruption and protect integrity. The message wasn't complicated. Create transparency. Document everything. Listen to students. Empower people at every level to question and report concerns. Hold everyone accountable, especially those in power. Simple principles, but remarkably difficult to implement in practice. They required constant vigilance and genuine commitment. One visiting administrator asked me, "Don't you get tired of always being watchful? Don't you want to just relax and do your job?" I understood the question, but I explained that being watchful was my job, not in a paranoid way, but in a professional way. Librarians organize information. That means noticing when information doesn't make sense, when numbers don't add up, when stories contradict evidence. Besides, I added, it's much less tiring to maintain good systems than to rebuild broken ones. The administrator nodded thoughtfully. Several months later, her school implemented new accountability measures. She sent me a thank you note saying my words had inspired their changes. These small ripples of influence felt significant. Change didn't have to be dramatic to be meaningful. Year 5 brought personal recognition I hadn't sought. The State Library Association nominated me for a Lifetime Achievement Award. The citation mentioned my exceptional courage in upholding ethical standards and advocating for student welfare. I almost declined the nomination. Awards made me uncomfortable. But Mrs. Chin convinced me to accept. You're not accepting for yourself, she said. You're accepting for every librarian who's ever spoken up and been ignored. You're showing that librarians matter. At the award ceremony, I gave a short speech. I talked about the power of documentation, the responsibility of noticing, and the importance of acting even when it's difficult. But I also acknowledged everyone who'd supported the transformation at Pinewood High. Mrs. Winters, Mrs. Chun, the teachers who'd found their courage, the students who'd trusted me with their stories. This award belongs to all of us, I said, because real change is never accomplished alone. The standing ovation embarrassed me, but I accepted it graciously. This moment wasn't about my ego. It was about validating the work that often goes unrecognized. After the ceremony, several young librarians approached me. They asked for advice about handling ethical dilemmas in their own schools. I told them what I'd learned: trust your instincts, document carefully, build alliances, don't act rashly, but don't stay silent indefinitely. Find the right moment and the right method for bringing truth to light. Most importantly, remember why you're doing this, not for recognition or revenge, but for the students who deserve better. As I entered my 17th year at Pinewood High, I reflected on everything that had changed and everything that remained constant. The library still stood at the school's heart, but it had evolved. We now offered digital literacy programs, college application workshops, and mental health resource sessions. The space served multiple purposes while maintaining its core mission, supporting student learning and growth. Mr. Kale and Ms. Fletcher's names had faded from regular conversation. New students had no idea who they were. That erasure felt appropriate. Their legacy wasn't worth preserving. But the systems we built to prevent future corruption remained strong. Transparency had become normal. Accountability was expected. Students knew they had advocates. Trevor Kincaid had graduated from college and returned to our district as a first-year teacher. He stopped by the library regularly, asking for advice and sharing stories about his students. I want to be the kind of teacher who notices when something's wrong, he told me once. Like you did. I assured him he already was. He'd experienced injustice personally. That experience had made him more aware, more empathetic, more willing to speak up for others. The Student Advocacy Committee, now in its 5th year, had expanded its influence. They advised on policy changes, participated in hiring committees, and regularly met with district administrators. Student voice had become integrated into decision-making processes. This was the sustainable change I'd hoped for, not dependent on any individual, but built into the school's culture and structure. One afternoon in late spring, a new student came to the library. She was a sophomore transfer, quiet and uncertain. She wandered the aisles for several minutes before approaching my desk. "Can I ask you something?" she said hesitantly. "Of course. I heard a teacher say something today that seemed wrong, about how grades work. But I'm new, and I don't want to cause problems." My heart recognized that uncertainty. I'd felt it too years ago, when I first started noticing problems, but doubted my own perceptions. "Tell me what you heard," I said gently. She explained the situation. The teacher had implied that students could improve grades by volunteering for certain activities that seemed designed to benefit the teacher personally rather than educate students. It probably wasn't corruption on the scale of Mr. Kale's schemes, but it was still wrong, still an abuse of power, however small. I thanked her for trusting me with the information. I explained I'd look into it carefully and discreetly. I assured her that coming forward had been brave and right. After she left, I began documenting, just like before. But this time I wasn't alone. I had allies, systems, and a school culture that supported accountability. I notified Mrs. Chun. She investigated immediately. The teacher received correction and retraining. The situation was resolved within days, not years. This was how it should work. Problems addressed early, transparently, fairly, before they could grow into something larger and more damaging. As the school year ended, I prepared for summer break with a sense of peace I'd never quite felt before. The work was never finished, of course. Maintaining ethical systems required constant attention, but the burden no longer fell solely on my shoulders. We'd built something larger than any individual, a culture where people at every level felt responsible for doing what was right. Mrs. Chin announced her retirement at the final staff meeting. She'd accepted a position at the state education department where she'd work on developing accountability standards for all schools. Her replacement would be carefully selected. The hiring committee, which included student representatives, would prioritize candidates who shared our commitment to transparency and fairness. I wasn't worried about losing the progress we'd made. It was too deeply embedded now. Too many people had invested in creating and maintaining these systems. On the last day of school, I stayed late in the library, as I always did. I walked the aisles, straightening books, checking for damage, preparing for the summer. The space felt peaceful, hopeful, full of potential. Trevor Kincaid stopped by to say goodbye before leaving for summer vacation. "Thank you again," he said, "for everything. You changed my life. You changed this whole school." I appreciated his gratitude, but I gently corrected him. We changed it together. You and all the other students who were brave enough to tell the truth. Mrs. Winters, who came forward with evidence. Mrs. Chun, who rebuilt the systems. All of us. He smiled. "I guess that's the real lesson, isn't it? That change requires everyone." Yes, that was exactly the lesson. 7 years had passed since that hallway moment when Mr. Kale's mocking words had ignited everything. Sometimes I still heard his voice in memory. "You're just the book lady." He'd meant it as an insult, but he'd been wrong about what that meant. Being the book lady meant organizing information, preserving evidence, noticing patterns, documenting truth. Those weren't small things. They were powerful things. I'd learned that power didn't come from authority or control. It came from integrity, patience, and the courage to speak truth even when it cost something. Mr. Kale and Miss Fletcher were gone, their corruption exposed and punished. But more importantly, we built something that transcended their removal. We created systems that protected students, empowered voices, and maintained accountability. The library remained at the center of it all, not because books were magic, but because information was power. And organizing that information, preserving it, making it accessible, that was how truth survived. I would retire someday, but the work would continue. The systems would persist. The culture would endure. That was my real legacy. Not exposing corruption, but building something better in its place. As I locked the library doors for summer break, I felt profound satisfaction. Not because the battle was won. Battles against injustice are never fully won. But because I'd done what I could with the resources I had when it mattered most. I'd rewritten the verdict. And in doing so, I'd helped rewrite the future.